On today's show, a not-so-great injury update for the Atlanta Hawks regarding Jalen Johnson and Onyeka Okongwu and their future in the immediate anyway, as well as an update on what might the rotation look like for the postseason and beyond for the Hawks, and we'll get into all of that coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1692 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you on a Thursday afternoon in emergency fashion. This is an emergency podcast. It is unplanned. It's going to be a little bit shorter than usual, and there's plenty to get to, but I should encourage you at the top of the podcast, if you are a new listener, to check us out and subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, as well as on YouTube on the video side. And basically a two-part episode here with regard to first and second. First, we'll talk about the details and what's happening with the injury updates regarding Jalen Johnson and Onyeka Okongwu. And then at the end of the podcast, we'll get into the kind of the fallout of what's transpiring here after those guys are going to be out for a while. So first things first, we'll begin with the updates that transpired. And by the way, I recorded this podcast about 1 p.m.-ish Eastern time on Thursday, and I did record about 12 hours ago. So if you missed anything from that, I talked about extensively the Hornets game and the fourth quarter decisions in that game, as well as the Heat game on the last episode of this podcast. Still very relevant at this point in time. But let's begin with Jalen Johnson. He is the better player and the more recent injury situation regarding with the Hawks right now. So as a recap, he left the game on Tuesday with an ankle sprain. It's actually his third right ankle sprain in the last 5 weeks or so. The first time he missed 3 games. The second time he missed 6 games. And then Wednesday's game against Charlotte was his first missed game in full since he sort of re-aggravated the injury on Tuesday. This time around, though, the diagnosis and the prognosis is worse for Jalen, according to the updates that the Hawks provided on Thursday. He had an MRI, and it revealed a grade 2 lateral ankle sprain. Grade 2 is not the worst, but it's not the best either. Officially, he's going to be reevaluated in 3 weeks. As I always say, reevaluation does not mean return, but if you're new to the Hawks injury roller coaster, the team does not give return to play projections. They always talk about reevaluation timelines, which can be treated as, for me anyway, basically at least, is the way I would think about that always from the outside, at least 3 weeks since he can actually come back and play, because again, that's reevaluation, which means usually you get reevaluated and it takes you a while longer to come back, even in a good scenario. So today is April 11th as I'm recording this podcast. 3 weeks from today is May 2nd. Maybe the first round of the playoffs is still going at that point in time. Not a guarantee of that. But functionally, this is going to take Johnson out for at least the first round of the playoffs, unless there's some sort of miracle here. And of course, for the Hawks, they have to get through the play-in first, which requires back-to-back sort of win-or-go-home games, probably with 2 games on the road, one of them definitely on the road, to even get into the playoffs. Then you kind of go, for him to come back even 3+ weeks from now, you probably have to go pretty deep in a series with Boston, all that stuff. I'm not going to tell you there's a 0% chance that Jalen plays again this year. I will not say that. I have not said that. I will not say that right now on this podcast. Even in the headline of the show, I'm going to use the word likely, because it is likely by the projections and probabilities and the timelines that he's not going to play again this year. It is not 0%, so I'm not saying that. I do think that it's unlikely that he plays at this point, based on the timeline and where the Hawks are right now with their season and the challenge ahead of them. Part of that is that if you factor in, they are less likely to win in the play-in or the playoffs without Jalen Johnson. He's one of their best 3 players. He's also a guy that's not really replaceable on this roster. He's the only guy, as I discussed a lot when he was out earlier in the season, no one gives the combination of his athleticism and length and passing and rebounding at that position on the roster. And yeah, there you go. So while I'm here, I wouldn't be terribly worried about the ankle long term. It's a little bit concerning, admittedly, because it was the same ankle 3 times in a short period of time. There's a chance that he kind of just rushed back the last time, and that was exacerbated. I'm not a doctor. I don't know the answer to that. But he'll have time to rehab, and I would not rush him now. If there's any concern, the future is more important than the present on Jalen. Even the most optimistic Hawks fan, I think you probably have to realize at this point in time that the Hawks are probably going to be entering the playoffs, or postseason, I should say, as the 10 spot. The chances of a deep run in the playoffs are not likely, so being careful with one of your franchise cornerstones is a good idea, so I wouldn't rush him along. Anyway, in the offseason, I'll talk about this more often. I'll go through the roster if you're a new listener and kind of do some deep dives on guys and where they stand at the end of the season. And quickly, though, for today's purposes, I'll just say that Johnson had a really good kind of breakout year in year 3. Obviously, more injuries than you would want by the end of the year. 56 games at the end of the season, but 16 points, almost 9 rebounds per game. He was, at least for me, in firm consideration for most improved player until he was not eligible anymore for that award. A very exciting future for a guy with huge tools, and he's a clear centerpiece of the Hawks moving forward. Still 22 years old until December. Like, the sky's the limit for Jalen Johnson. So it's an unfortunate, probable ending to the season for him. But obviously, the Hawks have found something there. It's easy to forget this. A year ago, Jaylen Johnson was the 9th man or 10th man at times for this Hawks team in his second season. Now he is, again, very clearly a top 3 player on the roster at the age of 22. So there you go. Brutal stuff, but unfortunately, he's going to be out probably until next season. From there, we'll go to Okongwu. For the background here on Okongwu, he's only played in 2 games since Valentine's Day with this ongoing left toe issue. You may remember this already, but as a refresher, he came back on March 18th, played in 2 games over 3 days, and then the Hawks kind of bizarrely listed him as out with being sort of, quote, injury management in the next game, of which that actually caused me to ask Quinn Snyder about that. He didn't like the question. He got a little bit annoyed with me. But then the Hawks changed the listing on Okongwu the next game. They removed injury management, and he has not played ever since. So that was just a bizarre sequence. But he's now missed 24 of the last 26 games. It'll be 26 of the last 28 when he misses these last 2 games. He was not in the building for the last 2 games for the Hawks, which I sort of took note of. And anyway, the Hawks announced on Thursday that Okongwu had a non-surgical procedure on Tuesday in Southern California to, quote, address ongoing inflammation in his left big toe, end quote. And the Hawks are now saying that his reevaluation, again, reevaluation, not return, is 4 weeks. So actually an extra week beyond where Jaylen is. All the same stuff applies with the timeline, except Okongwu is, again, a week later, so even less of a chance that he plays. Again, I wouldn't go to 0%, but even less of a chance that he plays than Johnson. And unlike with Jaylen, unfortunately for Onyeka, where like Jaylen's season was a clear and obvious success, he broke out, all that stuff. It was just an okay year for Okongwu. He was still good when he played. He had 67% true shooting. He lowered his turnover rate. He defended well. He averaged 10.7 rebounds a game, career high in points per game anyway. But his per minute numbers were actually down a little bit from last year, or flat a little bit. He didn't have a huge step forward, let's say, in year 4. Now, he signed an extension prior to the season, so he's already locked in for the next 4 years at a bargain price, in my opinion. But he had some injury stuff in the first 3 years of his career. Last year, he was very healthy, actually, played 80 games. This year, less so, obviously. I do think that the contract still looks totally fine / good. The Hawks got a good deal on him, good bargain. And honestly, I said this at the time, but I'll say it again now. Even if he is not a 32-minute full-time starter, that's still a totally fine contract, which is part of the why I liked it. But it will be interesting to see how the Hawks handle center. I'm not going to do that now. There's plenty of offseason talk about that, but Capella will be expiring contract. I've said before, but even as the biggest Capella advocate around, probably, I remain stunned that he's still on the team right now. So it's an interesting situation. If they move off from Capella, I don't believe that it's going to be as simple as sign a cheap backup and roll with Okongwu. I think they will probably end up investing either in the draft or in a relatively high-priced, or at least a reasonably priced, second center that's bigger, etc. So we'll get into all that later on. But obviously, we will see. But bad circumstances, and Okongwu will have basically played twice since the All-Star break, and in very limited minutes. So a tough ending for him. And as we'll get into in a second, it's a big loss on the court. Not only is it very obvious, but the Hawks have basically a definitive, coming into the year, they had a definitive top 8 players on their roster. One of them is now out for the season, has been out for a while, in Saddiq Bey. But this basically is going to functionally all but, again, not 100%, but likely take 3 of their top 8 away for the playoff run. And that's before you get into any other injury concerns. Trae Young just came back. That's a positive. We talked about that on the show last night. But at the best case scenario at this point, basically, the Hawks will be without 3 of their top 8 players in the playoffs or postseason run. So that's kind of tough, including just a lot of size. That's 3 of their 5 biggest core players as well, with regard to Okongwu, Jaylen, and Saddiq Bey. All right, we'll get into more coming up in a second about the impact on the playoff race, as well as impact just broadly speaking. But first, though, a word from our friends at Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that actually likes to push things a little bit further when you're behind the wheel? Do you ever happen to wonder what eventually could be waiting for you around the next corner when you are driving? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs and with the capabilities to take your next adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for both city drives and great escapes. It also has a class-exclusive Google built-in that you're always updating, assistant to call on for almost anything in the driving world, and gone are the days of connecting your phone because Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system with the Nissan Rogue, and the 2024 Rogue is perfect mid-size crossover for your next big adventure. They also have in their incredible lineup at Nissan the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder, which has seating up to 8 people, expansive cargo capacity, and it also has advanced available 4x4 capability. They have 284 horsepower, up to 6,000 pounds of towing, and when adventure calls, the Nissan Pathfinder is going to be there to answer that call for you. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. One more time, that is nissanusa.com. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, and it's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is also in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on each and every game. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and right now, if you get a new customer, and you are a new customer, probably if you're listening to this ad, get $150 in dollars when it comes to bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 if you can go ahead and sign up right now and guarantee that to bet on hoops, baseball, hockey, and so much more. But all of your favorite basketball players, baseball players, and teams, etc., with quick bets, same-game parlays, exclusive props, and much more. The app is so easy to use as well. They have everything you're looking for across the board, from over-unders to money lines to player props, future bets, and much more. The app is safe, it's secure. They cover the entire range of sports as well. Beyond the NBA, they have NFL, college football, MLB, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and so much more. And now is an awesome time to sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook, and the place to go is FanDuel.com/lockedon. One more time, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon, and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, so we touched on the nuts and bolts of the injury updates and kind of the impact and the timelines for Johnson and Okongwu. There are kind of two more things to get to here, and one of them is impacted by the other, so we'll start there first. So I got questions about the rotation. It's sort of the second part of this, basically without Jalen Onyeka, which I understand. And there's been some time to look at that in recent days, but still it's up in the air. There's a decent chance that Friday and Sunday do not matter at all in the standings, so we'll almost be previewing Wednesday's game in the play-in against Chicago in that winner-go-home game. But there are some locks to play, for sure. I'll get into that in a second, but I do want to go back to something I talked about on episode 1686 about 8 or 9 days ago. And that is, at the moment, Vit Krejci is not postseason eligible. When I say that, players on two-way contracts are not eligible to play in the playoffs, and Vit is still, at this moment on Thursday afternoon, on a two-way contract. I tried to warn people about that a little bit, wave the banner a little bit, before people kind of took notice of that. People kind of know that more often now, but it's a real factor moving forward. Vit was already in consideration to play in a play-in game, even if Jalen was available. But with Jalen Onyeka out, I think that Vit is a virtual lock, or at least very, very likely to play if he is eligible in a playoff game, because of his size and forward depth, and they just kind of need more bodies. Obviously, he's not Jalen. He is smaller, he is thinner, he is not the rebounder Jalen is, but the defensive end of the floor, Vit helps them more there. He's a good connector and a good passer in the way that Jalen is. So I'm not going to do this whole thing again, because again, episode 1686 is that full deep dive, but the simple reality is that the Hawks probably need to just waive Trent Forrest between now and Sunday. So I say Sunday because from what I can glean from the CBA, and this I'll give the caveat, I'm not an expert on this. I've asked around. The consensus is this. Basically, it seems like the Hawks, by the letter of the law, have to make this roster move if they want to convert or give Vit a new contract by the end of the season. It has to be kind of by Sunday, which is the finale for the Hawks. At the moment, the Hawks don't have a roster spot open, so the only way to create one right now, post deadline, to trade anybody is to waive someone. And there are two logical candidates: it's Trent Forrest and Wes Matthews. But especially with Trey now back and Kobe Buffkin available to play, there's a much, much better chance that Wes Matthews is needed to play in a game than there is with Trent Forrest. Plus, the Hawks also like Wes Matthews' leadership quite a bit. Now, the Hawks like Trent as well. Quinn loves Trent, dating back to Utah. Everyone likes Trent. I like Trent. I think he's a good guy and a good player in some ways and can definitely help you. But he's just kind of the odd man out if you do the math on this. Again, I'm not reporting that. That's just my logical conclusion, is that he is the logical candidate to move on from if they have to do that. They can't really functionally cut AJ Griffin or Mo Gay. They're not playing, but those guys are obviously future pieces for them. Sadiq Bey, if they cut him, they would lose his bird rights. They're not going to do that. Everybody else that's on a full contract is just playing. So they don't really have options beyond Matthews or Forrest, or just not having Vit available. That's the third option. I said that on that show previously, but there is a chance still, I would say it's non-zero, that they just kind of let it go and they don't have Vit in the playoffs. But I think with Jalen out, the urgency level does rise to kind of have Vit available. So he might play 20 minutes in that game or more. We'll see. It's a factor. Just circle that. I've talked about it a lot. We'll talk about it more if we need to. one small thing there. If I was the Hawks, I would not be just trying to convert Veet's contract. If a conversion, if you miss that with Trent Forrest, is that you just get it for the rest of the season and there's no long-term control. If I am the Hawks, I am trying to get Veet to sign a multi-year team-friendly contract because Veet, while people might be a little bit excited about him in some ways right now, I think he's very obviously an interesting player who is young and talented. What you don't want to have happen is have him be signed for the rest of the season, and then you have to lose him in free agency or have to lose it. So use your leverage now, try to sign him to a long-term deal or at least a multi-year deal that's team-friendly. But on Veet's side, he doesn't have to sign that. The only way the Hawks can unilaterally do anything is to just convert him. If they want to make an agreement on a multi-year deal, Veet's side has to agree, and Veet's side, I think, smartly would realize that they have some leverage. They don't have to just take the first offer. So keep that in mind. If Hawks fans were just yelling about how the Hawks should just sign Veet, all they can do on their own is convert Veet. There's an agent and a player on the other side that have agency as well. So keep that in mind for all that stuff. But we'll get into more of that later. Now, before we get out of here, we'll have a much more comprehensive preview stuff in between now and Wednesday because, again, likelihood is Friday's game, Sunday's game don't really mean a lot. So we'll have lots of time to talk about Wednesday's game against Chicago for the opportunity to stay alive in the playoffs. But with Jalen Onyeka out, I got questions about this. So the rotation is interesting. I would say there's probably 7 guys I would describe as virtual locks to play in a play-in game if they are healthy. Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, Bogdan Bogdanovic, DeAndre Hunter, and Clint Capella are the 5 uber locks. Those are pretty obvious. Then I think Garrison Matthews and Bruno Fernando are overwhelmingly likely to play. Number one, Bruno is the only other center they have. So they don't really have, Clint's not going to play more than 35 minutes at the absolute most, probably less than that. And without Jaylen, they don't even really have a small ball 5 option. So it's got to be Bruno. And then Garrison's played in almost every game this year. He's been a regular on the rotation. I'd be shocked if he just suddenly didn't play at all in that game. So that's 7. Then you have Veet. So I just said it, but if he's eligible, I think Veet will be the 8th man or the 7th man. One of those bench players. Maybe he might even start, honestly, in a play-in game because he's been starting with Jaylen out. That's 8 guys if he's eligible. And honestly, you could just stop there. In a play-in game or a playoff game with your season on the line, win or go home, Quinn might just play 8 guys. That's not going to be a huge surprise to me if he does that. So that's 8 right there. If you don't have Veet, or if you want to go a little bit deeper, I would say the next 2 options are Kobe Buffkin and Wes Matthews. Kobe is less of a lock because they would have Trae and DeJounte in this scenario, but if they wanted a third guard, Kobe's defense is pretty appealing at sometimes if they're playing as a small guard, etc. And then you have Wes Matthews, who I know I mentioned they could waive him, but one of the reasons why I don't think they will is because I think he is someone that Quinn could and might go to for 5 minutes in a playing game. It wouldn't shock me at all. He's a veteran. He defends. He executes. He isn't great, but they trust him. So that's 10 guys for 8 spots, maybe 7 spots, etc. We'll see on Veet. One note here before we get out of here. The Hawks are very small without Jalen Onyeka. Now, that's not breaking news, but they are really, really small because they're also, again, without Saddiq Bey, who played some power forward for them, big, bruising, physical guy. At the moment, the Hawks essentially have one guy that they would trust to be a legitimate power forward option in a play-in scenario, and that's DeAndre Hunter. Yes, they have Mo Gay. Yes, Mo Gay looked pretty good at times on Wednesday, but Mo Gay is not, I shouldn't say definitively, I don't believe Mo Gay is going to play in a postseason game in high leverage minutes. He's not played enough. He's still raw. I like him a lot. He's a rookie, all that stuff. So, and even then with Hunter, he's more of a combo forward. He's obviously played a lot of the 4, but he's like a pure 4 by any means. And the backup 4 is shrug emoji, Veet, Bogey. They don't really have another 4. Even Dylan Windler, who they've used at backup 4 spot, is not going to be eligible either. He's on a 2-way contract as well. And Seth Lundy on a 2-way contract as well. So the Hawks are going to be small. There's no way around it. They don't even have Onyeka to have as that backup power forward option next to Clint. They're limited here, and they're not going to play Clint and Bruno together, I don't think. Maybe against Chicago, but TBD. Anyway, they're small. They're rotation challenged. 3 of the top 8 players are out. On the bright side, to bring that a little bit of positivity into the podcast, Trae came back on Wednesday, looked like Trae. That's good to see. Have him and DeJounte and Bogey. You can score with anybody. Capella's been playing really well for the last 2 months or so. They're going to need a collective effort. The Hawks are not going to be afraid to go to Chicago by any means. That's not a team that's going to scare them. The second game in the play-in would be a little bit more challenging if they win that first one against either Indiana or Philadelphia or Miami, but that's not unwinnable either. So there's a path to a series against Boston for sure. We'll get into that more as we preview Wednesday's game between now and then, but that's it for the emergency podcast today. Hopefully that was helpful in sifting through all of what transpired here. It's definitely bad news. It's brutal stuff for Jalen and Onyeka. Root for those guys to get healthy as soon as possible. And look, if the Hawks were to make an unlikely run, maybe they come back later on. But that's all I have. Please subscribe to this show anywhere you get your podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend. Certainly, if you are already listening to the podcast, first of all, thank you for that. But second of all, please have someone in your life who might be interested in the Hawks. Share it with them. Send them a link on a text or an email or on social media or Instagram, whatever. Send them the show. Hopefully they will enjoy it, and I would appreciate that. Stay tuned, everybody. I'll be back with more content later on this week. At the very latest, I'll be back after the game on Friday, and we'll see you all next time.